Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Join host Sanjay Puri as he explores the dynamic and developing world of artificial intelligence governance. Each episode features deep dives with global leaders at the forefront of regulating AI responsibly, tackling the challenges using AI can bring about head-on and enabling balance without hindering innovation.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Artificial intelligence, AI, stands at the forefront of technological evolution, with experts predicting that it could add trillions of dollars to our GDP, but it could also negatively impact our workforce and national security. So how do we regulate it without stifling innovation? Our podcast features insights from various perspectives. We've had industry leaders, to government officials, to leaders of advocacy groups, and academics. Together, they address pivotal questions that are needed to create practical legislation. I'm very excited to have Professor Paul Rainey with us today. Paul is currently the director of the Department of Microbial Population Biology at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Biology in Plön. He's also professor at ESPCI in Paris. He's considered one of the world's most prominent experts of experimental evolutionary biology. I invited him on this show as we want to have many voices that can create practical legislation. And having the voice of the leading experts in evolutionary biology is very important. Welcome, Paul. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the Regulating AI podcast.
Thank you, Sanjay. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to see people thinking about AI reaching out as expansively as you are doing here.
Wonderful. Paul, for our audience, can you just give a brief idea of your background and your work and tell our audience what is an evolutionary biologist doing with AI?
I'm a New Zealander by birth, grew up there, did my PhD there, and then spent most of the rest of my life abroad. I became interested in microbiology, genetics, and evolution more or less at the same time, and my work spans those three disciplines. The field of experimental evolution, as you mentioned, one that I am very much involved in, is a relatively new branch of the study of evolution, a very exciting one because we get to watch evolution taking place in real time. And this is possible because the organisms we work with, bacteria, while being very small, replicate fast. They achieve immense population size simply by putting them in a nutritious flask overnight. And that means evolution takes place rapidly. And it means we can see how populations of organisms respond to particular selective challenges. And once we've observed that, we can take them apart using the tools of genetics and much more to understand the moment-by-moment workings of evolution. So to the question of what's an evolutionary biologist doing thinking about artificial intelligence, actually that for me comes quite naturally from a long-term interest that I've had, both theoretically and experimentally, in what are referred to as major evolutionary transitions in individuality. Let's unpack that for a moment. Major, they're very important events. Transitions, they involve the coming together of lower-level self-replicating entities to form a higher-level self-replicating structure. So let me give you one example to make this concrete, and it's one that is pertinent to thinking about possible future interactions between humans and artificial intelligence. And that is the evolutionary transition, the major evolutionary transition that gave rise to the eukaryotic cell, of which you and I, our bodies, are composed. This transition began a couple of billion years ago or so from two bacterial-like cells from different domains, actually, of life, archaebacteria, eubacteria. Before they began to interact, were self-replicating, Darwinian, meaning they're participating in the process of evolution by natural selection. And they, via interactions that unfortunately we still don't understand very well, came together. Not just in a sort of a trivial sense, although to begin with, they probably were just exchanging nutrients. One was beginning to depend on the other. They were interacting. What happened, and it only happened once in the history of life on this planet, one cell invaded the other or was engulfed by the other. And what happened then, these two separately replicating entities became part of a single corporate body. And that is an evolutionary transition, when two lower-level entities, the bacterial-like cells, come together to form a single higher-level self-replicating system. So major evolutionary transitions, and for me, a lot of interest is in the transition from cells to multicellular life. Let us think very generally about some of biology's most complex problems, actually. And it's thinking about these kinds of transitions, their causes, makes it possible to extend this kind of general thinking to thinking about plausible future evolutionary transitions between humans and artificial life.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack, Paul, but obviously it leads to thinking about, do you see any, you have talked right now, Paul started with, AI has been going on for decades now, but with the advance of large language models, and now with multimodal, and now conversation is about agents and super agents, which is something you talked about. But do you see any parallels between the self-replication mutation of biological viruses and similar behavior in AI superagents? And how would it manifest?
At the present time, people are not talking openly about developing self-replicating AI systems. ChatGPT, for example, is not able to replicate itself already I pause there, because actually, if someone copies it onto another machine, there is a replication event there. But anyway, it's not obviously participating freely in the process of evolution by natural selection. So what gives me pause for thought is the development of artificial intelligence systems that are endowed with what I would refer to as Darwinian properties, meaning properties that allow the system to participate in the process of evolution by natural selection. And that doesn't require very much. It requires just three things, actually, three properties. We need a population first, more than one thing, and there needs to be variation in that population. Those entities need to be able to replicate. And when they replicate, they need to give rise to offspring, obviously the result of replication, that resemble the parental type. So any set of entities that manifest variation, replication, and heredity will participate in the process of evolution by natural selection. They don't need to be biological. A simple algorithm on a computer that has these properties will participate in the process of evolution by natural selection. Why should we care about this? Here's the rub. Natural selection is an extraordinary force. Oh, sorry, it's not a force, it's a process that unfolds once entities have these properties of variation, replication, and heredity. The outcome of the process of evolution by natural selection is adaptation. The entities that participate in it get better at performing in their particular environment, performing a particular function. We know the power of selection because we see the extraordinary complexity of biological life. What gives me cause for concern with AI systems that might be endowed with these properties is indeed they will become better at doing whatever, they will become better in response to the particular selective pressures they experience in their environment. Just how they become better is almost unknowable. And that's where, and particularly if you have agential kinds of AI systems that get better by acquiring more power, because more power allows them to achieve a particular objective better, then I think there is reason to stop and think before letting that genie out of the bottle.
Paul, you wrote a very interesting paper recently about AI. In that, you made several key points. One of it is that AI could get power on its own, and also that in a symbiosis with AI, humans could really end up as a subordinate partner. That's a pretty strong statement. Can you explain why do you say those things?
If we go back to the evolutionary transition from ancestral bacterial-like entities that gave rise to the eukaryotic cell, we have what actually exemplifies all of the major evolutionary transitions, that those entities that were autonomous and free-living before the transition, after the transition, are part of a single corporate body, where they've lost much of that autonomy to the higher level structure. Now, again, if we look at the eukaryotic cell, back to your biology days in school, you will probably remember that there is a nucleus, and there are also, outside of the nucleus, little organelles called mitochondria. Mitochondria are the powerhouses of our eukaryotic cells. Now, it's the mitochondria that were derived from the ancient eubacterial cell, and the nucleus is largely derived from the ancient archibacterial cell. Now, neither could live apart today. You cannot separate them. That's your higher level corporate body. It's a wonderful innovation. But if you look at from the perspective of the lower level entities, the cells, they are no longer free to do what they like. They must play by the rules laid down by the higher level system. The mitochondria has its own little bit of DNA in it, and we know it once was a free-living cell. Depending on how you wish to look at this, you could argue very strongly that the mitochondria are enslaved to the to the nucleus. They certainly are enslaved. They cannot run amok. If they run amok, which does happen from time to time as a consequence of particular mutations, they can kill the cell. So the cell functions by virtue of the lower level parts doing what they ought to. And take that to the multicellular organism. Individual cells, before they became part of a multicellular organism, were autonomous. Now that they're part of a multicellular organism, they are absolutely enslaved to the developmental processes laid down by the multicellular organism itself. And that means our cells, for us to remain healthy and well, must obey instructions such as stop growing, such as now undergo cell death, commit suicide for the good of the organism. In each of these transitions, the higher level body is a wonderful entity, but those lower level entities of which it's composed have without doubt lost their autonomy. So there are various scenarios we could think through for possible future transitions between humans and some sort of agential self-replicating AI. But if we began to interact in a way that the eukaryotic cell emerged, then indeed humans would lose their autonomy. Part of that would be given up to the collective benefit, which is a combination of the AI and the human. Which is master and which is slave, it rather is a matter of perspective, but both would have lost some of their autonomy. And my real concern is that the AI may well come off on the upper hand with humans even unwittingly becoming enslaved by the artificial intelligence entity.
Unwittingly be slave. Wow, that's a scary thought. Do you see any, you talked about obviously this becoming a slave, and you talked about how the mitochondria, in some cases, they will commit suicide, follow instructions. Do you see any potential for harnessing the self-replication capabilities of AI for positive purposes, such as accelerating scientific discovery, solving complex world problems?
Absolutely. I see enormous benefits from developments in AI for humanity, but so often benefits often trade off with some sorts of risk. So I think the kinds of AI systems that would be most powerful, if they could align fully with objectives that we think are align with our own human objectives, then fine and fantastic. The trouble is, even if the AI system is not self-replicating, but is power-seeking, it may be difficult to see where it goes or control where it goes. If the AIs are endowed with Darwinian properties, i.e. they can participate, they have some replicative capacity, then I think it's very, there are a lot of ways it goes wrong. Selection will always favor, I'm going to be sweepingly general here, but very often favors the fastest or the most functional. And very often that leads to some sort of interaction where the balance is not equally shared. I'm thinking here where one partner begins to parasitize, take advantage unfairly, so to speak, of the other. So if we take lessons from evolutionary biology and we start thinking about developing self-replicating AIs that are agentially based, then I think we need to think deeply and hard and have a very strong societal engagement before we condone those sorts of developments. Because once, again, I don't want to be alarmist here, but once you've got a self-replicating system, it's very difficult to put it back in the bottle. Just take the COVID pandemic, for example. That's so amazingly problematic. Of course, there is the virus itself, but it's capable of evolving so rapidly, and we don't always know where it's going. We're trying to stay one step ahead with the next vaccine. Consider something that's potentially vastly smarter, is capable of agential thinking than a virus that has some self-replicative capacity. And yeah, again, I'm sounding alarmist, but it's hard to know how you would even regulate to stop. Even if you wanted to exploit the power of selection to optimize AI systems for good, how you would avoid such a system finding some way of subverting the originally intended goals laid down by the human. And once you start considering all-knowing AIs, well, it's the power, but maybe it's what the planet needs.
Yeah. Paul, are there any existing frameworks or approaches from your field of microbial population biology that might be applicable to regulating or mitigating risks with AI evolution? Or do you think researchers and policymakers from diverse fields like AI, biology, social sciences collaborate to address some of the challenges that you're talking about?
Most definitely. I think there are many guiding principles for sure, and predictive power and the theory of natural selection. So I do think thus far I'm not aware of many evolutionary biologists beginning to recognize that there is something to be contributed here from their field. But I think it is important that, one, the societal engagement discussion, but policymakers, particularly as AI becomes more powerful and if there are developments, it's relatively trivial to make something self-replicating, that before this happens, indeed, I think it would be wonderful, actually, and important that policymakers sit down with people that have an understanding of what selection is and how it works. And then there are many guiding principles that we could draw on. We could think about, maybe we could make AI systems that, let's say we would want them self-replicating, we would want there to be variation. Maybe we could devise them in some way whereby we could put something into the system that would act as a brake. Perhaps some way of reducing the mutation rate, for example. If we were able to suddenly once they were achieved a particular endpoint that was optimized by selection, we could then lock it in that state, eliminate any further possibility for evolution by stopping its capacity to generate mutation. But even then, I think if we've got all-knowing AIs, it will quickly find a way around that.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. Paul, there are in the AI community, there are two camps, so to speak. You have the doomsdayers, and then you have the techno optimists. The doomsdayer basically saying we need to pause because of AGI and all those other things, and the techno optimists saying there's the benefits outweigh the downside of it. How can we ensure that discussions around AI are informed by scientific evidence and diverse perspectives so that we avoid some of the sensationalism that happens? And to be very frank, are you proposing a pause on AI development?
Yes, I think there is an awful lot. There's a lot of extraordinary potential, without doubt. But I think we want to be wise as to how we proceed, at least going forward, aware of some of the risks. And of course, if we perceive risks, then it would give us reason to think about ways of alleviating those risks. So I certainly am not in the camp of saying don't do it, but I am suggesting that things could get beyond our control quicker than we think. And perhaps we, in some, and perhaps we could, using that word again, unwittingly find ourselves in a situation where things have already gone too far. That very much is an insight that comes from thinking about major evolutionary transitions, is that cells never set about trying to become a multicellular organism where they knew in advance that they were going to lose their autonomy. It happened very often for ecological reasons. So again, a sense quite often I see in looking at and thinking about major evolutionary transitions where the higher level entity has emerged as a consequence of the unwitting participation of the lower level entities.
Paul, are others in the, evolutionary biology community, are they talking about some of these things? And then do you think that there should be more public discourse and education to mitigate some of these risks? Because we have many guests that come across, and that's why this podcast is a platform that is wide. We have, education experts, we have had health experts, we have had all across the board, manufacturing, colleges, etc. Everybody is getting impacted by this. But what do you think is the role of public discourse and education in mitigating some of these risks? And are there others in your community talking about some of these things?
I think open discussion, engaged people in society is absolutely essential. So I would actually, the original article that I wrote, not the one that you were looking, but a predecessor, it came from some ideas, again, thinking about major evolutionary transitions that I began to formulate quite, well, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And this came with the recognition that even way back then, before model-based chat GPTs or anything like that were out there, I realized that it would be a relatively trivial matter for a despot, for example, to decide it wanted to effect an evolutionary transition to perhaps create a master warrior class, for example. It could actually be done very simply. And that sort of shocked me at first. And so I didn't write about it. And then I thought, no, I think these ideas should be out there. And I was in Israel at a meeting talking about future transitions in human societies. And I decided after that meeting that I would write about this idea. And that was, again, before all of the developments in AI. So in fact, my original thinking about this is rather naive, or was rather naive. So from my point of view, I think it's important to get ideas out there. It's then important to have people engage with these ideas, writing popular pieces and so on. As to my own community, no. Actually, those people thinking about researching major evolutionary transitions are not so many. It's tended to sit in the domain of the philosophers until relatively recently, in the last 10 years or so. But certainly people in my scientific profession have a lot to contribute in terms of their understanding of particularly how evolution works, which is very abstract in the sense of abstract. It's easily applied. It doesn't have to be to living systems. We can think about life on another planet. We can think about plausible systems where humans and AI might come together, and we can think about the possible consequences. And through that thinking, maybe we do know how to effectively control the process of evolution by natural selection in the lab. We can reduce its effectiveness. So anyways, I think there are many things that could be developed. But all of this evolutionary biology thinking here is most relevant to the possibilities that would emerge from development of self-replicating AIs. But even in the absence of that, we could think more generally about the transmission of ideas through AI systems, which would not actually require that they replicate, but maybe that's for another time.
Paul, from a microbial population biology perspective, what are the key differences and similarities between biological viruses and hypothetically self-replicating AI agents? Can we learn from our understanding of natural selection and evolution to somehow predict and control AI behavior, you think?
If the AI systems are Darwinian, i.e. they replicate, there's variation through mutation of some sort, and offspring resemble parents, then what we know about evolution from viruses, from bacteria, from theory, from studying Drosophila or finches on the Galapagos Islands, that all applies. That would all apply. So much in evolution is unpredictable. Predictable on one very general level. I can tell you, I don't even need to predict that if you get a set of entities that have these Darwinian properties, then they will participate in the process of evolution by natural selection, showing that Darwin was right. And the outcome will be adaptations, ever more complex life. So evolutionary, Darwin provided us with a predictive framework in this very general sense. But the specific details of where evolution takes one life form or another, that's often extremely difficult to predict. There's in this article that you mentioned, I drew attention to the work of Charles Freer using a very simple in silico system for looking at evolution in real time. His particular platform is the Avida platform. And the organisms that he's interested in are digital organisms. They're a set of instructions on a chromosome. But it's not a chromosome, it's just a set of instructions. And these are made to be Darwinian. They replicate. Variation arises by mutation. Offspring resemble parental types. And some wonderful studies have been done looking at evolution in silico. So these Avidians, they call them, they compete not for food, but for time on the central processor unit. It's their food. And what has amazed me are the number of examples from their work where there have been outcomes to experiments that they struggle to understand. And one that I think is just beautiful is when you set these Avidians replicating and they start to participate in the process of evolution by natural selection, those that replicate faster leave more offspring because they acquire resources more efficiently, increase, they outcompete them. And so Charles wanted to stop the fastest ones from always winning. So he said, okay, I'll easily do that. I will, every time there is a mutation, you can see every detail in these digital organisms. I will take that organism out. I will put it into a test environment, a different one, and I will measure its rate of replication. And if it replicates more rapidly, I won't put it back into the original environment. So he started to do this. And what he found was that these tiny, unsophisticated digital organisms evolved to recognize that they were in this second test environment. And they, on recognizing that, stopped replicating. That meant they didn't get thrown away. They went back into the environment. And they went through several iterations like this, where every time these simple, very simple self-replicating structures came up with surprises that were absolutely unanticipated. And again, we're not talking here about AI systems. We're talking about a very simple set of instructions that ensure replication, a few logic functions of a set of digital instructions. There's no capacity for thinking. There's no behavior. There's no memory other than what's set in the sequence of instructions. And yet, and again, this is what natural selection does. So yeah, I think there's those sorts of lessons. And we see these surprises in work with experimental evolution and bacteria. You never quite know what you're going to find, which is what makes it exciting. I think what is often not very well understood amongst biologists is what selection really is and what selection can do. And it continues to amaze me, actually, as an evolutionary biologist for decades now. I'm constantly amazed at what selection can deliver. Sometimes you look at things, certain evolutionary outcomes, and you go, that needs the guiding hand of a deity. And it turns out selection, acting on random variation, can generate extraordinary diversity and complexity. And so again, the lesson from those is it's very hard to know what particular route selection will take a population down.
Yeah, that's your piece about that experiment was fascinating because it's hard, as you said, you don't know what path it will go through. Paul, are there any specific policy recommendations or research directions that you would advocate to address your concerns about AI?
I think that the main is policies that engage people and bring together a range of perspectives and ideas for civil discourse, listening. We are at a time where if we were having this conversation 2 years ago, I think people would go, this is science fiction. This is just crazy talk. I think we've already progressed. We know this is not crazy talk necessarily. And policies that encourage engagement and discussion. And beyond that, I think if you get a broad enough group of people together that can respectfully listen to different perspectives, then I think one would hope some sort of consensus could emerge and maybe some principles that could guide formulation of policy.
Discussion and engagement of wide variety of perspectives. I think that's a great point. And in this podcast, we try to bring as many different voices as possible. Paul, finally, this has been an incredible session. Our audience, as I said, is members of Congress, think tanks, their staff, global audience. What message would you like to share with them about listeners who might be concerned about the potential risk of AI, but also hopeful about its potential benefits? This is your chance to talk to them, Paul.
Maybe to think outside of the box, to recognize that the systems that are being created at the present time are more than a set of engineered or instructions or computer code. So I guess we need to treat this new technology with respect, recognize that it could be a vehicle for much good, and indeed already is a vehicle for much good, I think, in the medical areas and machine learning approaches to image analysis and so on. There are immensely positive aspects to it. But in going forward, I think my encouragement would be to engage a broad swathe of people, even if they come from fields that may seem a long way removed from the hard core of algorithm development.
I think it's a great message to listen to different perspectives, wide range of opinions, and obviously a tremendous good, but this is consequential. Paul, this has been incredible. I've learned a lot to prepare, but also to listen. And we need to have you back again because this is a very important topic. What you're saying is there's a lesson to be learned in evolutionary biology towards AI. And I don't think too many people are talking about it. Not that I have heard. So we really thank you for your time and for the work that you're doing. So thank you for being such a great guest.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, Sanjay.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Regulating AI Innovate Responsibly podcast. You'll find links in the show notes to any resources mentioned on the show. If you're enjoying our podcast, please subscribe so you'll never miss an episode and leave us a 5-star review.